Hi, I'm Erica Payne. So I grew up in North Carolina. I worked in politics during the early part of my career, and then I was at the DNC during Clinton's first term, ultimately as deputy finance director for the DNC during his re-election campaign. And then I really wanted to get out of politics, so I thought, let me go to business school. And so when I came to business school, the story I tell is that I started in the process of those conversations with my fellow students who came from mostly traditional backgrounds. I started to look at politics as having a value chain like any other business has a value chain. So if you think of something like Nike, Nike has to source raw materials like canvas and rubber, design the tennis shoe, manufacture the tennis shoe, then come up with swoosh and just do it. And then they sell their tennis shoes. Then they hire Michael Jordan to be their spokesperson. Well, what progressives had done historically was search endlessly for exactly the right Michael Jordan and spent no time at all designing a better tennis shoe. And they were competing against the conservative movement, which beginning after the 1964 Goldwater defeat, a small group of self-interested billionaires started plowing a tremendous amount of money into think tanks, legal advocacy groups, media monitoring groups, legal organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Think of, those pictures of the iceberg where you see the sea line, and so you see this much of the iceberg, and then you see the water line, and you see all of this underneath it? That's the way to understand politics, is that so much of politics, this is the part that you can see, these are the candidates who come up with this, that, and the other. Underneath that line is hundreds of millions of dollars in everything from academia all the way through grassroots organizing. And so when I came to business school, I started to understand that process. I started to look at politics through that process. And so when I stayed in the private sector for a little while afterwards, and worked for a jet company, worked for a corporate entertainment company, and at a certain point, a friend of mine came up to me and she said, "Erica, you're running a serious risk of walking around with a permanently disappointed look on your face. Isn't that awful? And you need to deal with it." And I did need to deal with it. So I needed to go back to what I was really passionate about, which is social justice and economic justice. But I wanted to do it in a way that didn't have anything to do or had much less to do with politicians. So that's when I started really looking at what is the intellectual and communications infrastructure and network of organizations that are moving the politics of the nation around. And so learned about the development of all of these think tanks and legal advocacy groups and began to embark on a project to build a counterweight on the left, to start to fund permanent institutions like think tanks, legal advocacy groups, media monitoring groups, all of that stuff, so that we would have a fighting chance to bring a different sensibility into the American political system. So it occurred to me in this, think again, raw materials, packaging, marketing, distribution. The key in politics is really distribution. How do you distribute your ideas so that over time you gain the political power to implement those ideas through legislation and lawmaking? And so in order to get your distribution, most people rely on paid advertising. Paid advertising is very expensive. So as it turns out, if you get the right people to say the right things, you don't have to have nearly as much money to spread the message because it has natural resonance. But if the most interesting people say those things, then it gets carried naturally. So in 2010, President Obama was contemplating an extension of the Bush tax cuts for incomes over $1 million. And I was talking to the number 25 employee at Google and this lawyer in San Francisco, and this annoyed us. So we thought, let's write a letter. We wrote a letter that's about this long, and it basically said, all of us are millionaires, and we think that you should raise taxes on millionaires for the good of the country. Pretty straightforward, 2 or 3 paragraphs. We got about 45 millionaires to sign it, called them the Patriotic Millionaires, sent out some press releases, and it absolutely exploded in the media. And the White House began to see how valuable it was having a whole bunch of millionaires out there demanding higher taxes on themselves. And so the group then, we eventually succeeded in that. We got the picture here. And then we really looked around and said, okay, what is the biggest problem facing America that a group of a couple of hundred millionaires could do some good at? And we really decided to work on this concentration of wealth and power in America, and to approach it with 3 core ideas in mind. 1, regular people deserve as much political power as millionaires. 2, if you work full-time, you should be able to afford your basic needs. And 3, whatever the tab is for running the country at the end of the year, millionaires and corporations should pay for more of it. That framework is agreed to by about 70% of Americans across party lines, but nobody in charge in Washington seems to want to implement it. So we've just passed a tax bill that is a huge transfer of wealth from working people to the very upper echelons of society. We have a federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour. That translates into $15,000 a year. If you can get your mind around trying to live on $15,000 a year. 40% of Americans make less than $15 an hour, which is the equivalent of about $30,000 a year. And it is abundantly clear to anyone who is watching that millionaires and corporations and lobbyists have more power in Washington than anyone else. This is something that millionaires can help address because they're the ones with all the political power, with all the money. They're the ones making the decisions about how much they're paying their employees, and they're the ones making the decisions about how they're allocating their lobbying dollar to get out of their tax obligation. So we have built over time a group of about 200-ish millionaires. We're in 30 different states, obviously concentrated on the coast more than in other places, but we spend our time talking to the media. We are in 256 news stories last year. We placed 70 op-eds. And so that's the structure of the work that we do. We're attempting to be a public communications and advocacy organization, taking the words of business people and investors and making the business and investment case for a more stable and prosperous country brought about by a greater sense of political equality, a livable minimum wage, and a tax system that reinvests and asks for reinvestment from the people who've made so much off the country in the first place.